eine Minute innezuhalten, um die Opfer zu gedenken. Dankeschön. Hier das Koordinationskomitee Khaled Salame, Mustafa Jamra, Maison Belda und ich, Fuad Musa, begrüßen wir Sie recht herzlich in unserer bescheidenen Ausstellung. Insbesondere begrüßen wir Herrn Dr. Gartling, den Senator von Berlin, der uns die Ehre erweist. Und natürlich Herr Professor Dr. Sternbach kommt an die richtige Stelle. Unsere kleine Ausstellung und bescheidene sollte Ihnen eigentlich einen kleinen Einblick in die wichtige Vorgehensweise der Sicherheitskräfte gegen friedliche Demonstranten zu gewähren. Nun zeigen wir Ihnen ein kleines Video.
And children, and since every child is an artist, Syrian children painted on the walls of their schools in the city of Dara the first line of freedom. People wanted to topple the regime, and the revolution started. This is the story of a people who made a promise to defend their freedom, no retreat and no surrender. People who vowed to regain their freedom at all costs. They said, if our children couldn't dream of a better future, then our lives do not mean anything anymore. Before we tell the story of Hajar, Hamza, Tama and other children of Syria, we must know why their dreams were stolen. Why were they brutally tortured, killed and mutilated by the Assad regime? They have become the angels of the Syrian revolution. They miss their mums and dads, so they fly every Friday over the masses in the streets of Syria to guard the revolution of freedom and dignity and whisper to people the ancient Greek saying, the secret of happiness is freedom, the secret of freedom is courage. Here is Syria, an ancient pearl in the cradle of civilization, where 40 years ago the Assad family built a far-reaching security apparatus designed to break Syrians' will and to put the whole country under a systematic policy of repression and fear. Here in Syria, where mosques and churches are side by side and people live in brotherhood with great diversity of religions and races, that dream was seized in 1963, and the story froze when Syria fell under the rule of one party that controlled the people by imposing a state of emergency. Then came Hafez al-Assad through a military coup, keeping the state of emergency for another half-century. Yes, for half a century, the Syrian people have been living under Assad's emergency tyranny. In the 80s, where people questioned their fate, Assad hid behind claims of armed religious groups. So cities were surrounded with tanks, bombed and razed to the ground. People were killed, arrested, or just disappeared. Hamas witnessed genocides of people, regardless of their religion or their affiliation. In some areas, the Assad forces did not spare women or children. Not only that, the regime also carried out a massacre of hundreds of political prisoners in Tadmor prison, all without trial. The regime killed in the 80s between 20,000 and 42,000 martyrs from all religions and ethnicities. The city of Hama was destroyed entirely. Political activists were arrested and put in prison. The voice of freedom was silenced. During the years that followed the massacre of Hama in the 80s, the Assad regime followed a systematic policy of controlling all aspects of life in Syria. The regime imposed military education for children and students in schools and universities to build a military state and undermine the idea of civil society. Through a full control of all media, culture, and education curricula in Syria, the Assad regime raised a new generation with absolute loyalty to the ruler, Hafez al-Assad. Assad believed he may swipe Syrian memory of Hamas massacre over the years, that people will forget the crimes and killings that took place in the 80s. But he was completely wrong. The memory of the children of Hama reached the children of Dara, and they started the peaceful revolution. On February the 17th, 2011, an unprecedented scene in Syria as an estimated 1,500 people took to the streets in a spontaneous protest. They were angry that the son of a shop owner had been allegedly beaten by a traffic police officer. So they went onto the streets at Harika, just south of Souk al-Hamadiyya in Damascus. They chanted, "The Syrian people will not be humiliated." Again on March the 16th, 2011, security forces dispersed a demonstration by dozens of relatives of prisoners near the Interior Ministry. The families of 21 jailed human rights activists in Syria had announced plans to lobby Interior Minister for the release of their relatives. A few days later, 15 children were arrested by the security police in the southern Syrian city of Dara for writing revolutionary slogans on walls of their school. They were tortured and their nails were pulled out. This led to a series of peaceful demonstrations calling for the children's release, the sacking of local officials, and an end to the decades-long state of emergency. But security forces opened fire on protesters, killing 5 protesters and fueling the people's rage. A week later, more than 24 protesters were killed in Dara by Assad snipers from the security forces. As always, a full media blackout was imposed by the Syrian regime. Demonstrations followed in Damascus, Banias, Homs, Hama, Latakia, Jibla, Kamashli, and Hasaka. Protesters marched again in several cities for greater political freedom. Assad security forces continued to shoot unarmed civilians, chanting for freedom and democracy. Live ammunition was used to disperse peaceful rallies on the outskirts of the capital, Damascus. The calls of freedom began to fill the Syrian streets in various cities and regions, with the same slogan used by Dera's children: People want to topple the regime. The Assad regime began to kill a new number of peaceful demonstrators each day. The army continued to set up roadblocks outside the towns and suburbs where there were the biggest protests, and banned international journalists and media from going to the demonstrations. The government denied responsibility for the violence, saying that armed groups had fired on its security forces and protesters. Over the last 4 months, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime and his security forces, the army and private militia, have been responsible for at least 2,000 killings, 15,000 injuries caused to men, women and children, and 15,000 arbitrary detentions. Despite initial promises of reform, al-Assad shows no signs of relenting his suppression of the opposition. Whole cities such as Dara, Homs, Hama, Banias and surrounding areas remain under siege, with little or no access to water, electricity, communication or medical supplies. The Syrian regime launched its army on its own people. The army began to enter and bomb the Syrian cities, preventing food, water and babies' formula, and imposing the siege on the cities and arresting men, women, the elderly and children. The security services have been arbitrarily detaining hundreds of protesters in Dara, Damascus, Duma, Al-Tal, Homs and Banias, and subjecting many to torture. Techniques reported by the detainees include electroshock devices, whips and beatings. Human rights activists and protesters, their families, lawyers, journalists, writers, university and high school students, community leaders and those found using mobile phones to record the protests were singled out for abusive treatment as well. Children were also among those detained. In some areas, Dara is an outstanding example. Detentions were completely arbitrary. In early May, the government seemed to have gained the upper hand, but the protests revived again and again, driven in part by the internet activists, especially the sharing online of a video that showed the body of a 13-year-old boy, Hamza Ali al-Khatib, went with his family from Al-Jiza in March to break the siege of Dara. He was among the unlucky hundreds detained during the massacre of Sida in front of the army barrier. Hamza's dead body was later handed over to his family with clear traces of torture. Bruises all over his body, bullets penetrating his corpse, and even more, his genital organ was cut off, and then he was killed. Hamza is only one of the thousands of victims of the murderous regime of al-Assad. The story of Hamza is unfortunately one of many. The brutal regime did the same to Qamar al-Sharif from Dara. The security forces injured his eyes, broke his teeth and his neck. Another example is the child Hajar al-Khatib, a pretty girl with a nice smile, full of childhood dreams, killed by the bullet of a security personnel. There are many men, women, children and elderly who have yet to be returned to their families. More than 50 children were killed either by torturing them or shooting at them by snipers. One cannot imagine the amount of torture inflicted upon these unarmed civilians by the Nazi and barbaric Syrian regime. Assad continued sending tanks into restive cities as security forces opened fire on demonstrators. The army started bombing more Syrian cities. By mid-June, human rights groups said that more than 1,500 people had been killed, mostly protesters, and more than 10,000 people were reported to be in custody or missing. The country's economy was headed towards the point of collapse as tourism in particular withered. Syrian cities turned into armed camps as President Bashar al-Assad tried to reclaim control of the country. Syria's brutal crackdown against pro-democracy protests took a chilling turn at the end of May with the discovery of mass graves in the city of Dara. Authorities immediately cordoned off the area to prevent residents from recovering the bodies. More than 1,600 martyrs recorded, including more than 50 children and 60 women, in addition to 12,000 detainees. The recent military offensive in the north of the country has forced thousands of Syrians to flee towards Turkey and Lebanon, About 11,000 Syrians already taking refuge at tent cities erected by the Turkish Red Crescent in the border province of Hatay. Now, let us remember Hamza, Tamir, Hajar, and the rest of the Syrian children who were tortured and killed by the Assad regime, whose innocent souls, who held a torch and gave their lives to illuminate our path to freedom, for their suffering, their pain, and their stolen dreams, light a candle for them with us to keep their bright memories alive and glowing.